Hello, everyone. I'm Giulio Prisco, and in this episode of the Turing Church podcast, I am in conversation with philosopher Eric Steinhart, who is one of my favorite philosophers. Good to see you, Eric. Hello.
Hello, good to see you.
Great. So I'd like to start with a discussion of your last book titled Believing in Dawkins, the New Spiritual Atheism. Well, you call it spiritual atheism, while I prefer to call it spiritual naturalism, and it is very close to my own religion, which seems a kind of strange to say. I do highly recommend your book. The only things that I don't like about it are the title and some kind of militant antagonism to traditional religion that I think is unnecessary and even counterproductive. Anyway, the first thing that I'd like to ask you is whether Richard Dawkins said anything at all about your book, and in this case, what?
As far as I know, no. Generally, when you write a book about a living author, another living author, in this case Dawkins, you don't have any contact with them. So, no.
No. I kind of suspected that. At the same time, I suspect that you must have been criticized by others, or maybe even by Dawkins, even if you don't know it, for interpreting Dawkins in a way that offers too much consolation to believers and religious people. And one of the examples, the main example that I have in mind, is when you note that Dawkins frequently affirms that there is no life after death, but you say that this is inconsistent with his own convictions. I kind of agree. Dawkins, you say, should have argued that false religious theories of life after death can be replaced by more plausible scientific theories of life after death. I do completely agree with this, but I kind of suspect that Dawkins wouldn't, and some of his followers wouldn't as well. Did you get any criticism along these lines?
No, I have not. I don't see. I mean, so there were a lot of questions in there, or statements in there, and the first one was that would atheists regard me as providing too much consolation for believers? Well, I guess if believers means Christian believers, I'm not sure what that means. I mean, there are lots of other religions besides Christianity, as you know, and there are new religions too. It would be hard for me to see that there's any consolation for Christians in the book, in the sense that it's Dawkins is very opposed to the Abrahamic religions, including Christianity, and the book reflects that. I don't see why life after death would be. I mean, part of the point of the book is to argue against Christonormativity, which takes Christianity as normative or standard, or as defining the problems in the space of solutions to these kinds of questions. Hindus, ancient Greek and Roman pagans, Buddhists, all have theories of life after death in various kinds, which are very much non-Christian. And so I don't see that why, and of course, transhumanists and people who think of these religious ideas in more computational terms also have theories of life after death. And, from Hans Moravec to Nick Bostrom, right? There's no, to be Christonormative would be to say that Christianity has, possession of this idea of life after death. It's a Christian idea. And if I were to affirm it, then, or think Dawkins is affirming it, that makes me more similar to Christians. And that's just false. Christianity does not possess this idea. It does not belong to them. It's an idea that belongs to everybody. And in my point of view, right, what I argue in the book, as well as my previous book, Your Digital Afterlives, is that life after death should be de-religionized. It's just an issue for, as I've put it, for theoretical computer science. The brain is a computational process. There's no reason why computational processes can't be moved from one hardware substrate to another. And this has nothing to do with Christianity. It's completely independent. So I don't see that but that was sort of the first part of that question. So I don't see that there's any, if Christians were to embrace this idea, if they were to embrace more computational approaches to life after death, I've got no argument against that. I have no objection to that. But getting away from the Christonormativity and thinking that this idea belongs to them, it just doesn't, and it never has. But you also asked about Dawkins' own, consistency, and Dawkins says lots of things. He's often, the book is a critical, philosophical examination of Dawkins, and also developing I'm happy to call it spiritual naturalism, as you called it. The titles of books are chosen by publishers, not by authors. Yes. And so probably spiritual atheism sells more books, which is also fine with the author, but spiritual atheism is fine too. And so, Dawkins, like a lot of atheists of his generation, I might put Dan Dennett in there too, Sam Harris a little less, and certainly the Four Horsemen and Chris Hitchens, about the same, have a kind of allergic reaction to Christianity, where it's just without thinking, if Christians say something, they'll just say the opposite. And it's like, wait a minute, your own things you have said point to, in this case, this particular case, as in others, point to a very Dawkinsian theory of life after death, which begins all the way back with the Selfish Gene book, right, in which genes have this kind of immortality. They're pieces of information copied from cell to cell, from organism to organism, potentially immortal. Well, okay, just extend that reasoning to brains, or extend that reasoning to the entire body, and also things a little bit more deeply that Dawkins says about complexity. If what he says about complexity is true, then it really has to be the case that there has to be an evolutionary sequence of universes. If what he says about complexity is true, our universe is very complex, and that means that it was produced in a sequence of increasingly complex universes, an evolutionary lineage. And this, again, is just reading really straightforwardly things that Dawkins says all over the place. And that would certainly seem to imply that our universe is followed by a number of descendant offspring universes. And if complexity follows the Dawkinsian account, the most complex thing, the more complex something is in our universe, the more likely it's going to be preserved very accurately in the next universe. That follows from Dawkinsian principles about complexity, right? If you lose, right, complexity is very fragile. He calls it improbable. He's right? Complex things are highly improbable. And the more complex something is, the more improbable it is. So if complexity is going to continue to increase or be preserved, then the complex things in our universe have to be preserved with great fidelity, because the more complex something is, even small changes very rapidly destroy complexity. And this is all Dawkins, it's not me. So, there's an argument there. And maybe it's not a great argument. That's not essentially for me to decide. Maybe it's not a great argument. Maybe it is a great argument. But Dawkins just is blind to being able to see this, right? Because the only theory, this is the Christonormativity, which I think completely infects all of contemporary Anglophone atheism. Oh, Christians say it's about this weird soul. It's about some heaven and hell. And that's the only theory that they seem to be able to understand. And if that one's false, then they're all false. And that's just bad reasoning. So yeah, one of my constant complaints about contemporary and Anglophone atheism is it's so Christonormative. And I often suspect, as an increasing number of people say, that it's a kind of Protestantism. It's a negative or apophatic kind of Protestantism, which would explain a lot of why they make the kinds of claims they do. But there you go. That was kind of hopefully a bit of an answer to several points that you raised.
I understand, and I agree with most of what you said. I guess I suspected that, when I suspected that you must have received a lot of criticism, I guess I had in mind exactly this very negative reaction to anything that sounds like religion. That sounds like religion at all, that some of today's so-called militant atheists and some of Dawkins' followers immediately have when they hear, for example, a philosopher talking about the very theoretical possibility of life after death. It kind of seems to me that they must interpret this as a, siding with the enemy. You see what I mean? That, if you say something that looks so much like religion, then you are not a good atheist, and you are not one of our tribe. That's what I have in mind.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I haven't received much of that kind of criticism. I think 10 years ago or 12 years ago, I might have. I think a lot of, atheists have moved on from that. And I think, as you know, and something that I would, have written about elsewhere, I would just turn to transhumanism and say, look, the transhumanists have these other ideas. And so if somebody says that, if somebody thinks that religion is just Christianity, I'm just going to call them a Christian. And I call atheists Christians all the time. Right. And oftentimes, I'll say, no, you're the Christian because you can't think outside of Christian concepts and categories.
That's a really excellent point, I believe. Well, of course, you realize that even among those who call themselves transhumanists, there is a very strong and very instinctive knee-jerk reaction when they hear someone discussing scientifically the possibility of life after death, because they don't want to even consider that, because it sounds too much like religion to them. And I understand that your answer to them would be that this is a misunderstanding that stems from identifying religion with Christianity, right?
Right. I mean, I think that even if you look at what just was done, the experiment that was just done, I don't know if you know about this, with Daniel Dennett and GPT-3. GPT-3, the large language model, artificial intelligence, where they did a fine tuning of GPT-3 with Daniel Dennett's philosophical writings. Did you read about this experiment?
I did.
Yeah, and so they trained it, and they got this trained GPT-3, this fine-tuned, artificial Daniel Dennett, to answer questions that were asked about Dennett's philosophy. And I took part in this experiment, and because I've read, thousands of pages of Dennett, and I did pretty well, which was to say I did slightly better than chance. And in fact, professional philosophers were not able to distinguish between GPT-3 and Daniel Dennett. So there we go. We got we got Daniel Dennett, his philosophical brain. He could die, and this GPT-3 thing would still be able to be Dan Dennett. Now it's kind of it's a little silly. I mean, the GPT-3 is still a long way away from,
exactly,
human artificial general intelligence, but it's a proof of concept. I mean, it shows that this is not, it's not absurd, right? I mean, and presuming that the, large language models get better, brain simulation gets better, we can gain access to more information. These are old transhumanist arguments, right? All the way back to Moravec in 1988, yes. Scan brains, get more information from everybody's life on the web and internet and recording. These things are going to get more and more accurate to the point where questions about difference don't really make a difference. So I don't see that. So I really do think that, and in fact, that's where I was really initially, with that book, Your Digital Afterlives, said, look, these technological approaches, computational approaches to life after death are perhaps surprisingly practical. Even if I can make the philosophical argument that, in theory, they can work. I've been surprised. I was surprised to see the Dennett thing work so well, in 2022. I thought it wouldn't be till a lot further down the road. So I just point to things like that and say, like, I don't understand what the counter argument would, oh, this is too religious. I don't see making a copy of Dan Dennett's brain inside a, GPT-3. If that's religion, that's a fine religion with me. So.
By the way, it's interesting that there is this new, even more recent example of GPT-3, like between brackets, artificial intelligence, that there is this Google engineer who has been fired after that, has said that a Google language model is self-aware, conscious like a person. I do agree that all these things are advancing very fast. I'm not very optimistic in the prospect of real human-like artificial intelligence next week. That would be too soon. But I guess we'll see something like that for sure before the end of the century. However, there is a difference between the kind of resurrection that you have when you have done something to preserve an individual, for example, uploading the mental structure of Daniel Dennett onto an AI, and the kind of resurrection that you have when you have done nothing of the sort, but something else, not necessarily human agency acting now, manage to resurrect the people anyway. In fact, this brings me to the next question that I have in mind, is that for those who have not read Believing in Dawkins or your previous book, Your Digital Afterlives, could you give a very short summary of your speculation on plausible scientific theories of life after death?
Sure. Yeah, there are a few main ones that have been discussed in the literature. The first one is very much like the Dan Dennett example, where you take somebody's whole digital life, everything they've typed into Facebook, all their writings, if they have photographs, everything they've sort of left behind or generated in terms of information. And you just upload that into some kind of AI platform like GPT-3 or GPT-47, whatever it may be, and you recreate a model of that person. That's the sort of most trivial kind, and probably at this point the most practical. Especially as, again, people are leaving behind larger and larger digital, digital wakes, digital streams behind them of all this data we're generating. It's remarkable. My grandparents probably left a few megabytes of data behind them in the form of old black and white pictures. I've generated hundreds of gigabytes, if not probably at least a terabyte of personalized data, right? And that's a lot. And it might not be, in this case, some of these things might be more accessible than one thinks, because being humans, we tend to think, I'm so unique, I'm a snowflake, I'm a super individual, nobody else is like me. It might not be the case that I'm so unique that I can't be very accurately recreated from a small amount of data. Maybe a terabyte is enough, right? Because maybe the parameter space isn't that big. So that's the first thing, right? Just getting all this data you've left behind and uploading it into an AI model like the Dennett, artificial Dennett in GPT-3. That's the first kind of case. A second kind of case is where you really just an extension of the first, where you do, brain scanning and brain uploading, that kind of thing. That's just really an extension where you're getting more data from the body, right? And it might one of the things we didn't really talk about there with those kinds of things is right now I can get a full genetic scan, right? And that's information too that could be used to finely tune an AI model, right? You could say, look at all these genes that function in Steinhart's brain or Dennett's brain or your brain, and that can be fed into a model as well, right? So there's lots of data that can be used. And I think the brain uploading is just an extension of that. The next thing would be to think about things like Nick Bostrom and before him. Hans Moravec is really the revolutionary figure with all of this, particularly since he wrote that book, Mind Children, and he himself was possibly dying of testicular cancer. And
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he had been diagnosed with testicular cancer. And his wife
would be 20 plus years ago when he wrote My Children.
Well, he wrote it in the mid 1980s, the early 1980s, so 40 years ago.
Right, so it's almost 40 years ago, and he recovered, and
yeah,
that's great.
Yeah, but he thought,
I'm
a robotics scientist. I'm building these artificial animals. Why couldn't I build another one that's like me? And he thought about all these ways that this kind of thing could happen. One of the more interesting ones, I think, is the simulation hypothesis, right? That says things like, okay, we are, I hate to use the word simulation because, video games generally aren't simulations, right? They're their own worlds. But if we are actually, characters in a computer generated universe, right, then whatever computer is generating this universe can be keeping an exact recording of me. And that recording could be used to, produce another Eric Steinhart in the next iteration of the video game. Or more intriguingly, as Moravec suggested, and this was actually done, right? As Moravec suggested, well, if you're a character in a video game, the video game engineers, they monitor you, they record all your data of your life in the game, and then they could actually use that data and plug it into a robot in their world outside the game. And he called that promotion. Right, so that's another kind of technological theory of life after death, that if we are in fact in a software generated universe, or computer generated universe, that data file could be put into a robot that mind file, as he called it, and then Kurzweil called it, could be put into a robot in the actual universe where this software, simulation is, the video game is running. So that was actually done. These guys that I think, forget if it was Carnegie Mellon, doesn't matter. They actually built, a simple game with these simple organisms, had them live, and then, took a recording of one of them, because they were all individualized. There was, simulated evolution, stuff like that. Took a recording of one of them and built a little robot in their world that they programmed to behave exactly like this, what had been a software creature inside a computer. And so that's, again, proof of concept, right? It's who knows if we're actually living in a video game, a software universe, but it's certainly not unscientific or untechnological to think that way. And there are good reasons to think that too. So that would be the second main one, right? Promotion. And then the third one is just thinking that I mentioned before, that our universe is just one in a series of universes. Arguments from complexity and from evolutionary theory would say, look, you want complex organisms, you need evolution, you need lineages of organisms, and information is copied from organism to organism, right? From, parents to their offspring. And the same is going to happen with universes at the cosmic scale. And if information is copied, well, then in the next universes, there are going to be copies of me. And they might be modified in certain ways. They can't be modified too much, or, the complexity building process is destroyed.
Can I just interrupt you one moment?
Sure.
Information is copied. At this point, many people, I think, would ask, information is copied by whom or by what?
It's not copied by anybody. I mean, information gets copied in biology. It's not copied by anyone, right? There's a process. Now,
but it's not copied by someone, but it is copied by something, which is the basic laws of physics and biology are what copies information in this case. And that, I think you would answer that is also the case for the copying of information from parent universe to child universe, right? It is something built in the laws of nature.
That's correct. It's a natural process. I mean, we can, there can be various discussions about the details there, but at a philosophical level, I mean, I'm an old computer scientist. I'm a computationalist. I think that universes are generated by a computation too, even if it's not like a video game kind of thing, but the whole process of nature is a computation. Now, obviously I could be wrong about that, but from a computational perspective, universes are just generated by a recursive algorithm, or an iterative process of some sort. And so there doesn't need to be any who, there doesn't even need to be a what, right? It's the laws of nature themselves ensure that this process of cosmological evolution happens.
Right. Myself, I have always thought that in particular, the simulation cosmology that you just mentioned is not only scientifically sound, but it is also religiously sound, in the sense that I myself, at least, always found it completely indistinguishable from traditional religion as far as the really important things are concerned. I mean, in a simulation cosmology, we don't have the exact Christian mythology. We don't have any of the mythologies of other established religion, but the core idea that the reality of this universe has been built by something that lives in a higher level of reality. I mean, the concept is the same. And the idea that this can offer a way to resurrect people by copying them from this reality to the higher level reality is exactly the same thing, and we can call them heaven. So to me, at least, the simulation cosmology says exactly the same thing that Christianity says when we talk of the really important things. Well, of course, not all computationalists would agree, and not all Christian believers would agree. But to me, it has always been exactly the same concept. But in my schedule, we come to this point later. So please continue with what you were saying. Sorry for interrupting.
No, that's fine. I think maybe that's probably the sort of three main sorts of theories of computational theories of life after death. So we can go to the next question, I think.
Yes, in fact, this kind of the now you have given a short list of your speculations on plausible scientific theories of life after death. What do you think Sir Richard Dawkins would say about your speculations?
I mean, some of them he explicitly agrees with, right? He's perfectly perfectly happy with a lot of the more concrete things. He said things like he thinks, yeah, you could make a copy of someone in an AI, right? There's nothing surprising about that. He's also very well aware that you could take somebody's genetic code and make a clone of them, right? He discusses that at a variety of points. So you could take my exact genetic code, make a clone of me, and would that be me or not? Well, not really, sort of. But he's aware of those kinds of physical copying processes, and he is aware of the simulation hypothesis in the God delusion. I think it's actually pages 98 to 100 or so. He discusses it several places, but he says it's a perfectly intelligible and sound idea. He can't disprove it, and that would make these things possible too, right? He does not think that gives much hope or comfort to Abrahamists, because particularly, as you said, the mythology would be gone, right? You'd be left with some very abstract view that, oh, there are some agents that created our universe. Oh, it's like God. Well, but it might be polytheism, right? I mean, thousands and thousands of people are required to make video games. So there must be thousands and thousands of gods in heaven. I mean, so it's not, and there are going to be parallels with Hinduism or Buddhism as well. So it's not clear why, yeah, there's a generic structure there that resembles some of the, more abstract philosophical parts of lots of religions. But Dawkins, in his books, right, he's well aware of most of these ideas, right? And again, some of which, I mean, some versions of the simulation hypothesis he finds a little far-fetched. Other versions he says, yeah, that this universe is computational, it's running on a computer. It's not really falsifiable, and there are good plausible reasons to think that could be true. And it makes sense of a lot of things in a very scientific way. So he's aware of these things, but what his actual opinions are about them, he hasn't really said.
Interesting. Yeah, I have also read in many places, like for example, in a New York Times interview about 10 years ago, that he said something that he also says in the God Delusion, that there are very likely extremely advanced intelligences out there which would be indistinguishable from God, which is what I think as well. Right. Sometimes it's good to hear these things coming from Dawkins.
Well, he says a lot of things people would think are weird because they don't read him,
Right.
You know, he's some celebrity atheist, and people think I know what he says. I don't have to read him.
Yeah.
And there are also, he's written a lot of stuff besides the big popular books. He's engaged, and it's also funny because you find theologians or Christians who say like, oh, he hasn't engaged with theology. And yet, if you actually go look, he's written all sorts of articles in theological journals. You know, he wrote one in a debate with a theologian named Poole, where he argues that, okay, fine, God is really complex. The only way you get complex things is by evolution. Therefore, the only way you could have a complex God would be if there's an evolving population of gods. And he discusses this, you know, and you're like, oh, wait, Dawkins is saying there could be an evolving population of gods, you know, and it's like, yes, he does. And so, but you got to go in, you know, you're kind of going into the weeds here. You got to get down into I think I'm like the only person who's done that, who's read all this stuff, you know.
Well, not all, but I think I have read most of his books. Perhaps not all. I'm sure not all.
Well, you got to read the articles, right? Because, you know, he was a professor and he wrote journal articles. So.
Right. In fact, you know, I mean, I'm not a conventional believer, but well, when people ask me to make a binary choice between believer and atheist, I tend to choose to say that I am a believer. But, you know, all these things, I don't find them shocking at all. I mean, thousands of gods, evolving gods, computational gods. I mean, who cares if the result is the same? The result being that there is something that is pulling the universe toward a good state, as you say in the book. And maybe this something can even ensure that we will be resurrected in an afterlife. I mean, that's what I want. Who cares whether the mythology of any traditional religion is still there? I mean, the important thing is what gets done.
Sure.
There's something very nice that you say in the book is that the job that used to be done by a god can be done by the natural mechanism of the universe itself. That's right. Something that I like very much to hear. And in fact, let's leave religion aside for a while. I'm going to come back today and move to physics.
Sure.
In fact, I think the most interesting parts of your book is when you discuss concepts like cranes that lift matter to greater heights of complexity, and skewers or deep non-random factors in the laws of physics that favor complexity. You say that the cranes and the skewers could be powered by almost known thermodynamics. For example, some version of maximum entropy production principles, or by more exotic, purely informational principles at the roots of physics that maximize value production. Here, let me say that you sound like Robert Pirsig, who said pretty much the same things in different words. And you coin the term axiotropy, which means value growth for these things. Now, my question is, do we need radically new physics to make sense of axiotropy, or is today's physics almost good enough? Schrödinger, in What is Life, speculated on other laws of physics that should complement known physics if we want to understand life. And do you think that your axiotropy or Schrödinger's other laws of physics could be just incremental improvements to the physics we already know, or would they be entirely new physics?
That's a great question. Yeah. I don't think it's radically new physics. In fact, I think the physics is very close to that. And when I say very close, you know, some people might get the misimpression that people often have very bad understandings of physics. I study a lot of physics, and people think, oh, physics is settled. You know, I think, in fact, contemporary physics especially is a mess. And so people are like, oh, the second law of thermodynamics, and you want to say there's actually no such thing. There maybe is now. I mean, there were 47 different versions of the second law. And since the Dawkins book was published, I'll just mention this, right? The second law, a very clear version of the second law has been deduced from axioms of quantum information theory. That just happened last year. It happened this year, earlier this year.
Can you give me a reference on that?
No. I'll refer you to, I could refer you to, you know, if you know that webzine Quanta magazine.
Yes.
Yeah, they had a lovely article about it, because it's you know, it's dozens of people who have worked this out.
Right. Yes, I have seen many articles of this kind, but you know, I have seen many of them, not just one.
Right.
So I'm curious on what exactly you have in mind. Would that be the theories of Jeremy England by any chance?
No, England will come into this point later, right? Because England's working at a much higher level. But so thermodynamics, right? I mean, thermodynamics, first of all, what's happening in contemporary physics really is a revolution right now as we speak. And it's an informational revolution.
Yes.
Right? Where quantum theory is being rewritten in terms of information theory. And thermodynamical principles are being derived from information theoretic principles. There's lots of work, for instance, trying to derive fundamental forces like gravity or electromagnetism from things like quantum entanglement, which is, you know, information theoretic.
Yes.
And this program is generally known as it from qubit.
Yes.
Right. And
right.
It used
so
to be
that's what you have in mind, exactly.
That's right. And so the it from qubit program, right, we start to rethink quantum field theory in terms of information theory, start to think of the emergence of particles and other structures. There's a physicist, Xiaogang Wen, who writes a lot about this. There's lots of, I mean, this is happening as we speak. I find it very exciting. But what we find is, for instance, people have a very bizarre view of thermodynamics and entropy, for instance. You know, entropy is not disorder. That's not what entropy is. I mean, but I'd get technical now. Entropy is a measure of the flatness of a potential distribution. Okay, what did that mean? Well, so I mean, people say, oh, thermodynamics, second law, entropy is always increasing, disorder is increasing, blah, blah. No, that's in fact completely wrong. The second law seems to entail something like entropy is increasing, yes, but that entropy increases at, not only is entropy being maximized, but the rate at which entropy is being produced is maximized. So that's the maximum entropy production principle. Now, the maximum entropy production principle has also been derived from the same information theoretic foundations as the recent work on the second law. The issue isn't whether this is, you know, accepted science or something. It is. The issue is that there's still a lot of work to be done in making this precise.
Right.
Right. There's and there's lots of experimental questions too. It's like, well, we've 3 or 4 versions mathematically of this thing. What is the exact correct one? Well, that science will do its work, but it's not going to come up with something, at least at this point, it's not going to come up with something different. It's going to be, you know, we're tweaking the little details here. And the maximum entropy production principle says systems tend to maximize their entropy production rates. And it turns out, not surprisingly, that more complex dynamics produce entropy faster than less complex dynamics, right? And so this means immediately what the second law is doing is it's driving the evolution of complexity. And it's making complexity grow. And now eventually, of course, all that complexity will be gone. But what all these things are doing, you know, stars, I mean, stars are pumping complexity into black holes, if you want to think of it that way. And eventually it's all going to get pumped into the black holes, and that'll be that. But in the meantime, right, you've got at the center of our solar system an extremely low entropy object, right? The core of the sun is about as low entropy as you can get. And this thing is, you know, pumping entropy into the black hole at the center of the Milky Way, right? And as it's doing that, the only way to do that is to generate more and more complexity around itself, right? Low complexity flows don't generate much entropy, right? So, okay, and this has all been worked out with great precision, yes, great physical precision. Right. So if we want to say like it's not entirely accepted, well, it is accepted. The details still need to be refined. So Marty Yushev and people like him and Dewar, they have versions of the maximum entropy production principle. Jeremy England, who you mentioned, he has a slightly different version, you know, and he says his version is better than theirs. They say, no, ours, but that's a debate,
right, yes,
at the level of the detail.
Right.
It's not a level of the debate about the general principles.
You think from the conceptual point of view, we are almost there, and the answer to the nature of the trains lies in thermodynamics, and specifically in some other version of the maximum entropy production principle.
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, the maximum entropy production principle is a kind of thing that you can state in English, right? And so, you know, systems tend to maximize their entropy production rates. Well, now we need a very precise mathematical definition of entropy production, all these things, and
right,
there's
would
details there.
Would this be what, some people said, a fourth law of thermodynamics, or can it be derived rigorously from the parts of thermodynamics that we are already familiar with, or is it a new?
Yeah, as far as I know, it's not.
Principle
it's not
to
new.
add to that.
No,
it's not new.
It just follows from. I mean, I have to trust what the scientists are saying, and perhaps things could be revised. But people like Dewar, who worked out the math, a scientist named Dewar worked out a mathematical derivation of a maximum entropy production principle from the second law. So most people seem to think that it's actually, you know, just the expression of the second law, and the other laws, the zeroth, first, second, third laws, right? So I don't think it's new, and but I could be wrong. I'm not a scientist, and I'll agree with whatever they say about it. But it does seem like you know, people are starting to really think about these issues. They have been for the last 30 years. You know, the thermodynamics of computation, right? The relations between you know, information theory and thermodynamics and computation, which has become really you know, the thing that really brought this home was the emergence of quantum computing. Right. Once people realized, oh, quantum computers, and they also realized that you know, entanglement is for real. Right. It's not some, you know, bug in the system. You know, there's experimental confirmation of it, and it's far deeper and more general than one thinks. I think the big piece of the puzzle is going to be whether or not gravity can really be, this is what everybody wants, right? To derive gravity from quantum information theory.
Right.
And see if they can do that.
Yeah. In fact, it's good that you mentioned quantum information and quantum computers, because, you know, when I think of the status of our knowledge of physics right now, and its potential to explain all the things that we are discussing, its potential to make sense of axiotropy. I always think that, in fact, we have this debate on what quantum mechanics mean that has been going on for 100 years and doesn't show any sign of being settled one way or another. I do tend to think that what quantum mechanics mean must be very relevant to all these things that we are discussing. And well, I think you would agree on that, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think, right. I think, I mean, I'm hopeful that, you know, the basic principles of quantum theory are being, they are being rewritten in terms of information theory. And of course, we don't, you know, I don't know, we don't know if that is going to be a completely successful program. So far, it's a program that's shown amazing success. And, you know, hopefully in my lifetime, I'll see whether this program really bears fruit or not. Right.
Let's hope so.
Yeah.
Question that I would like very much to see an answer to in my lifetime is on these things that also have been discussed from many centuries now on whether the universe is fully deterministic or not, which I think, you know, I like to read the works of all the scientists and philosophers who argue one way or another, almost always disagreeing with each other. But I think it is still very much of an open question. Just like to hear where you stand on that, or are you agnostic as at this moment I am?
Yeah, I think that first of all, there's real problem there with the concept of determinism is there's really no good definition of what that means. And if you start to look at it and ask, well, what does it mean to say the universe is determined? So far, there's really sort of only two answers to that. One is that, you know, given any complete state description, you know, there's like a, you know, primitive recursive algorithm that can produce all the subsequent states. And that, I don't know, but that doesn't seem to be a very powerful statement. Another is, you know, determinism is deduction, right? That given any, you know, complete description of the past, you know, there's a deductive proof of any future state, right? Obviously, it doesn't have to be a proof carried out by humans, just that there's a proof in the second or, you know, first or second order predicate calculus of whatever future state one might name. And that also seems to be very poorly defined.
How would you define determinism?
I have no idea. I mean, that as I, you know, at one point in writing a bunch of things I've been asked to write, you know, I started looking into this and said, you know, this is I used to think, you know, when I hadn't thought about it, that this was a pretty clearly defined notion. And then starting to research it, I came to the conclusion that this is a completely undefined concept. Or the definitions of the concept, either the computable or deductive model, are like really weak. And you know, people often say Newtonian physics is deterministic, and it's not deterministic in any of those senses. Right. Yeah, it's not. And so it's really not clear to me what it means to say the dynamics of a system are deterministic. I mean, I do get it. I get that the dynamics of the game of life are deterministic. I get it.
Yeah, in fact, you know, that's the same mental strategy that I use to think about these things, which is to translate them in terms of elementary cellular automata, which, you know, it makes thinking about these things easier because you can, you know, ignore real numbers, chaos. Yeah,
you can ignore real physics.
Yeah, and think of a simple finite model with simple rules, the Wolfram approach. But by the way, how do you like Wolfram's approach?
let me mention this other automata thing first, which is that you don't have to go much beyond, say, the game of life. If you just go to like, lattice gas automata, which are just cellular automata that implement very simple collision rules, you already have systems that are not deterministic in either a, computability or deductibility sense. There's just very simple modifications to the game of life, and you already get something that doesn't work. So Wolfram, Wolfram's interesting. I don't know what to think of, again, these just seem to be scientific questions. His latest thing about graph rewriting strategies for physics. I mean, that's very interesting because graph rewriting is a really it's probably one of the most powerful techniques you can have mathematically for thinking about dynamics. But does it have any physical reality? It's not for me to say. I have no idea. It looks pretty. The stuff looks pretty that he has on his website.
Right.
Does it have any physical validity at all? I have no idea. No clue.
Right. Okay. So as far as physics is concerned, let's agree that we would like to see some answers to all that within our lifetime. I think
that would be nice.
Yeah, that's the best we can say. Let's go back to religion for a little while. And I'm wondering whether your spiritual naturalism could be formulated in a way that is less antagonistic to established religions. And in general, what do you think are the realistic prospects for this very interesting worldview that you are building?
Sure. Well, I'm interested in new religions, right? I mean, I'm interested in new ways of being spiritual, new ways of being religious. And as I mentioned before, in a lot of ways, I think, Anglophone atheism is a kind of, apophatic Christianity. It's negative theology.
I'm going to steal that from you.
It's not even original with me, right? There's a whole lot of sociologists and other folks who have. There's just a book, and I'm blanking on the author's name, but I think it's Fraser, called "The Secret Sympathy." Right, a whole book on how Anglophone atheism is a particular version of Protestantism.
I'm Googling that as we speak.
Yeah. And so, lots of people have observed this more recently as they've reflected on what are the dynamics of
excuse me, could you say the title of the book again?
It's called The Secret Sympathy. Secret Sympathy. Hopefully I got that right.
Here it is. Yes, you did. I think I'm going to read that book. Sorry for the interruption. Please.
No problem. And so I'm interested in ways of just getting beyond that. Like, I get frustrated with atheists who just want to talk about God, because I don't want to talk about God. I don't believe in God, and why would I talk about? I don't spend my days talking about leprechauns and unicorns, so I'd like to talk about the things that I do think exist. And I would like to see the emergence of new forms of, I'm hesitant to even use the word religion, but new forms of religiosity. And I think that certainly within the history of the West, those forms exist. They have existed. There was ancient paganism. There's new forms of paganism. Even if that's a problematic word, which it is for some people, there are new ways that people are putting these things into practice. There's atheistic pagans, atheopaganism. There's a spiritual naturalist society. I don't really make
Hold on. What is the spiritual naturalist society?
Well, there's two groups that I mentioned there. The one is the atheopaganism group,
right,
which is a large organized group. And they've got a website and various social media channels and things like that. So they are atheistic pagans, and they do all sorts of fascinating things, right? And then there are humanistic pagans. There's a group called the Humanistic Pagans. There's the Spiritual Naturalist Society, which has a website, right? It's easy to Google. They're not so much an organized group as just people who are interested in spiritual naturalism. So there are lots of little groups, some of which are the atheopagans aren't so little, but and it's hard to make predictions across, oceans and continents. Certainly religion is changing in the United States very rapidly, right? Christianity is declining at an astonishing rate. There's obviously a very angry back reaction to that with Christian nationalists and things like that. I really doubt that there's anything they could do to stem this tide. Predictions are that even within, 20 years, America could be a minority Christian nation. And what will emerge in the wake of that? Well, I don't know, right? I just don't know. It could be something that's very new, like, okay, I'm a philosopher, and so I'm trained in ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, and I'll be like, oh, Plato, and most people probably don't care about that. They're like, well, some dead guy from thousands of years ago. But you see all sorts of new ideas bubbling up all over the place. Again, there's various transhumanist, organizations and things like that. Computational kinds of forms of spirituality. Obviously, like, westernized Buddhism, Stoicism is back. I regard Stoicism as a pagan philosophy. So I just the creativity that's happening now is astonishing.
Yes.
Right. And who knows?
Yeah. And, in fact, all these could be new religions. But don't you think that perhaps it would be simple, in some sense, to import this approach within more traditional religions? I mean, I have seen you giving a great talk once at the conference of the Mormon Transhumanist Association. And you are also aware that there is a Christian Transhumanist Association, which, in my opinion, represent a very interesting way to, build some kind of bridge between traditional religions and these new ideas that are coming out. You think there is some potential in that?
I doubt it. Again, I want to be cautious about predicting social changes, because those can be really wild and completely, not conform to any of our expectations. Certainly, though, the trend lines for the older religions all pretty much point down. And
even Islam? How about Islam?
Well, again, the one problem certainly with Islam is that it's very difficult to get accurate data. Right. The best data that I've seen comes out of places like Iran, where they say that, and perhaps it's a similar thing, the politicization of Islam made people much less religious. So that, in fact, it's...
Or much more religious?
No, much less.
Much less.
Participation rates and things like that go way down. But you can't, even within the United States, it's very difficult to rely on any data here, right? Because, certainly in the United States, with freedom of religion, somebody can give a more honest answer, but they often don't. It's something known as the halo effect. But what you see, right, with actual eyes on the ground is, church attendance extremely declining. And certainly the pandemic accelerated that to the point where even hardcore denominations like the Southern Baptists that once had seems to be just surviving all this, right? Their attendance rates have plummeted. And their youth retention rates are, you know, down sometimes in the single digits, right? And so you know, I mean, certainly across vast swaths of the United States, you find nothing but empty and abandoned churches. So what will happen in the wake of that? I don't know. Right. I would not have predicted a collapse like this would happen so fast in the United States. Maybe there'll be a counter reaction, a counter revolution, and it'll be swept away. Maybe people are just going to revert to all you know, crystals and tarot cards and astrology and witchcraft, and it's just going to be a popular, they'll just be a messy, new agey, neo-pagan-y mess. And people just won't really care about these big ideas or some might care, but they'll turn to various sources. There won't be a coherent, I think, the way that Abrahamic religions, the monotheistic traditions, provided a singular kind of coherent vision, and said, this is the narrative. Even if we demythologize it, I doubt that. I mean, people just aren't going to be interested in that, right? They're going to be like, yeah, I combine crystals with yoga. Okay, well, I combine yoga with Buddhism, or yoga with goats, or Buddhism with astrology, or they're going to do, you know, it's going to be a herd of cats. And they're going to go wherever they want. That's what I think is the most likely outcome, but we'll see.
We'll see. And what is this thing with Burning Man? You seem to consider it something like a next generation service for spiritual naturalists.
I think that, again, Burning Man is, and people often misunderstand that, especially, you know, outside of the United States, or even in the US, people think, oh, it's a music festival, which it's not. I mean, it's nothing to do with music. But Burning Man is a transformational festival, one of the first and oldest, and largest. You know, it's a festival in the desert where you have I won't go into too much, don't need to go into too much detail, but
do you go to Burning Man?
You know, I've never been. I was going to go and then the pandemic happened. Once I started getting interested in it, I thought I should go, and then there was the pandemic, and so my plans were ended. So we'll see. It's just started again. It was a 2-year hiatus, and it just started back up this year. And I'm not sure I'm prepared to like do all the traveling I would need to do do that at this point. So we'll see. But I don't, and I'm not particularly concerned with the details of Burning Man itself. It's just a model of something that, from a, you know, an academic point of view, looks very religious, looks very ritualized, very, there's a thing, right? You burn a figure of a man at the, you know, during it. And then at the end, which people often don't realize, the climax is not burning the man, it's burning the temple. Right, there's a temple that's built. The temple is very interesting because the temple people write or put objects or written statements of often their hopes and fears, you know, or memorial. They've lost someone has died, and a little memorial to the person who's passed away, or things that they say about themselves. You know, I'm fighting cancer. You know, hope I can beat cancer, or I overcame, you know, drug addiction. Or, you know, I'm overcoming a divorce or something. You know, they put all these very personal things they have to leave behind, things they want to overcome, things they're struggling with. And the temple gets filled with these things. And on the very last night of the festival, you know, the man is burned, and with, you know, yelling and partying and hooray, woo, and we burn the man. But at the end, the very last night, the temple is burned, and it's burned in silence. You know, and people weep and they have whatever, but the whole structure, I mean, seems to me, and again, I don't mean to focus too much on Burning Man in particular, right? But the whole structure, because Burning Man also, there were a lot more transformational festivals that sprang out of it in different ways. There's an excellent series on those festivals called The Bloom, which is visual. Right, 3 films about transformational festivals, And that kind of thing could, you know, if you want to see a more institutionalized sort of thing that could come after the Abrahamic religions in the West, that could happen, right? That could be a thing that scales up. And again, maybe I'm not trying to make a prediction. I'm just trying to say, like, here are some interesting sources of creativity, right? Religious creativity, spiritual creativity, however one would want to phrase it. Or maybe those concepts are just gone too. And maybe it's like, yeah, we do this new thing. This is what we do.
Very interesting indeed. Very interesting indeed. Okay, Eric, I won't take more of your time. And thank you very much for joining me.
Sure. Great to talk with you, and great questions.